Molt bon dia a tothom, benvinguts i benvingudes amb aquest acte d'Esquerra Republicana.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this event organized by ERC, Esquerra Republicana. We will be discussing the future of the European Union with several speakers on a very practical note. This event links up to a long-standing work that we had done in the past, where we had been thinking about this debate about the future of the European Union, also thinking what our view was as Esquerra Republicana. We published a book on our approach. We already mentioned that we didn't want to leave the European Union at the hands of those who wanted to weaken it. So our approach back then is still valid, which is to come closer to a more united, more democratic Europe with more freedom and more resources and with better leaderships. At the end of the day, the approach that we will be defending and expanding on today is to have this possible Europe that is able to face global challenges such as environmental transition, the strengthening of the welfare state, fair legal system, as well as other questions that we will be focusing on today. And before we move further, a couple of housekeeping notes. You can listen to this event in the original language, or you can listen to it either in Catalan or English. You can just press the language interpretation icon that you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And throughout this online event, you'll be able to ask questions as well to the speakers. You can use the chat function. You can also state exactly the speaker the question is addressed to. And at the end of this event, we will have a Q&A section where the speakers will be able to answer and react to the comments, observations, and questions you will have addressed.
My name is Sara Bailac. I'm the Vice Secretary General for Political Action of Esquerra Republicana. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar where we will be discussing about the challenges that the European Union will have to face in the future. We will offer a practical contribution to the Conference of the Future of Europe, and we will ask our guests this morning to share their thoughts on what should the European Union do for its citizens but doesn't yet do. Sense més preàmbuls, presentarem la primera.
So without further ado, I will now introduce the first speaker of the morning session. She's Meritxell Serret. She is the delegate of the Catalan government at the European Union. She was Catalan Minister for Fisheries, Agriculture and Food at the Catalan government in 2016-2017. She's the coordinator of several publications, amongst which the Atlas of New Rural Reality and Agricultural Co-ops in Catalonia. Good morning, Meritxell. Welcome, and you have the floor. Thank you, Sara. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be able to participate in this event, and especially on the topic that I've been allocated, which is how at the European Union people are defending rights and freedoms, which are the foundational values upon which the EU was built, and therefore it should be their custodian. If there's something that has become clear today more than ever, is that the EU has its own shortcomings in order to ensure those rights and those freedoms. It is something that it should be part of its DNA because of its own development and evolution, but especially in the past few years, we have seen certain double standards being used. First, we have a message that is conveyed and that comes across about these rights and freedoms, but then internally, there are different reactions to that idea. So we have seen that double yardstick, those double standards internally at the EU on how rights and freedoms are defended, which has brought us to the current situation. Within the EU itself, some member states are constantly violating the rule of law and fundamental rights. And they are even in an ability, in a position to weaken the EU and to hinder the Union when new right-based decisions or initiatives are being pushed forward in order to reinforce this ability to fight for the rights and freedoms of all its citizens. Therefore, we need to make headway as firm EU believers. So we need to evolve into a stronger union in this particular field, justice and defending rights and freedoms within the EU, because we are consistent with its foundational values. It is linked to its integration process, offering more federalism, more subsidiarity, therefore a higher degree of equality across EU, regardless of the country or region, and also to favor a kind of governance without this veto power held by some specific member states, with a more multi-level governance, therefore bringing policy making closer to the different governmental levels and to citizens themselves. There are specific measures under discussion, such as, for instance, this control and protection measure. We have the famous Article 7 that is being applied to Poland and Hungary, but is obviously not sufficient. So we need to move forward. We agree and we congratulate the Commission for that first yearly report on the state of law, where they analyze the current rule of law situation in all our countries. We obviously believe there are shortcomings. We believe that the analysis that has been done on Spain, for instance, is lacking. Still, it's a step forward. And with this rule of law mechanism, democracy and fundamental rights, it is a nice notion, but it falls short because apparently it will not be applied thoroughly to all cases, and it should be a mechanism preserving rights and freedoms and therefore ensuring an equal treatment of all European citizens. So there should be a higher degree of overseeing, let's say, judicial independence, corruption. We need that overseeing capacity so that the EU is able to make these rights and freedoms prevail. Secondly, we also believe that it's important to review and to expand the interpretation of Article 51 of the Fundamental Rights Charter so that it's binding for all member states, because all judges and judicial authorities of all different levels of the legal systems in all member states bear this in mind and enforce it in a harmonized fashion. And also the human rights, the Convention on Human Rights, we need to bolster the observance of the European Union of this convention, because this has to happen in all European countries, in all European territories. Otherwise, we run the risk of violating. And obviously, there's something else, which is another right, very important right that we defend and stand for in Catalonia, like other nations in the EU, which is the right to self-determination. It's a human right. It is a way to ensure justice and peace, because whenever there's a political conflict, we can only solve it through democracy. But claiming one's rights and by standing for citizens' rights to decide freely on their future, and all political choices that are defended democratically and the respect of these fundamental rights. Also, something else which is fundamental is to urge the European Union to protect the right to freedom of opinion and of assembly. We have seen this on several occasions, unfortunately in Spain as well, that the right to protest is violated repeatedly. And in order to enjoy a healthier democracy, because this is a citizen's right, we should ensure that people enjoy the right to freedom of assembly and of protest. So a European code of conduct and police ethics should help us fight, for instance, the gag law that is still in force in Spain. So we need to protect freedom of opinion, of expression, of press, and of information. It is extremely important, the independence of the media and journalists as professionals, and also to protect everyone who reports corruption or negligence that we find in many areas of power. It is important, especially in this digital era, to preserve the digital rights of both individuals and groups. And in order to make headway, we need to act on artificial intelligence, because these will obviously enter our homes and it will endanger our individual rights. A couple more things. The Directive on Equality, this has been stuck in the European Union for 10 years now, so we need to achieve a certain progress so that all these freedoms can be harmonized across Europe, and these equality policies should be applicable to all areas in a person's life, in housing, in healthcare. And finally, we need to put an end to this idea of a fortress Europe. We need to be done with this idea of being completely blocked from the world and not letting people in and consider them illegal. We need to adopt new legislation against racism, against these hate crimes. Therefore, we need an open channel, an open way, so that people who migrate can enjoy opportunities and can have, well, an ability to become a European citizen and therefore become fully fledged European citizens in our societies. That's it for me. I know that there are a lot of people who would like to take the floor, and I'm sure that there will be time later on to have a short discussion afterwards with all our colleagues about these proposals that we offer, so that the European Union becomes what its founding members understood it should be: an area protecting freedom, harmony, a custodian of human rights for all its citizens, and a contributor all across the globe to defend these values of democracy and freedom, so that they can prevail all over the planet, and therefore ensuring that human rights are respected in all societies. Great. Thank you, Meritxell, for your contribution about this need to ensure fundamental rights at the European Union, a situation that you know very well because it has impacted you in the flesh, in this case by Spain. We'll continue speaking about rights, in this case social rights, working policies, and that's why we'll give the floor to the next speaker, who is Camil Roche. He's the Secretary General of the UGT Trade Union in Catalonia. He's worked with several companies in the building industry, and then when he was very young, he started being very political. In 1996, he set up the Avalat Young People Trade Union in Catalonia, and then between 1998 and 2008, he was the Secretary General of UGT Trade Union in the Girona province. He's been part of the National Council of this trade union in Catalonia, first as a sectorial policy secretary, and then trade union policies, coordinating the foreign affairs area, and right now as the main Secretary General of this trade union in Catalonia. Good morning, Camil. You have the floor.
Bon dia i bé, primer de tot
Good morning. Well, first and foremost, thank you all very much.
Per poder parlar i estar avui amb vosaltres.
Thanks for this invitation to be part of this event. I'm delighted to be here and to be able to reflect upon the current situation and our policies today, because at a time in which one gets the feeling that the trend is to look inward and to look to our belly buttons, I think it's important to have this European dimension in mind. So, European dimension as Catalonia, but also we have another international dimension, which is the Mediterranean scope. So all activities that can be undertaken with our neighbors from north and south and east, I think this should be the framework of most of our activities. We are Mediterranean citizens, but we're also European citizens. So that is also integrated into our viewpoint. As I was saying, at a moment in which, because of the COVID crisis, our
En aquest
reality
cas,
is
una crisi
changing,
sanitària pot acabar
and a
tenint
healthcare
una
crisis
dimensió i una
can
crisi
end
econòmica
up having a much
com la que s'està generant.
different scope,
El
economic in nature,
d'Europa,
like the one we're
doncs,
suffering.
podem dir allò que hi ha la bona notícia i la
So
mala
about
notícia.
Europe, we could say there are good
La
and
mala
bad news.
notícia doncs, és que
The bad
l'Europa
news
dels
about
anys,
Europe
especialment doncs,
is
a partir
that,
de l'anterior crisi econòmica,
especially because of
no
the
ha
earlier
respost al
financial
paper que li tocava o
crisis,
al
the
paper
Europe of the
d'aquella
states
gent
has not
que creia
responded, has
amb
not taken
l'importància
on the role
d'Europa
that we all
com la
thought
nostra manera
Europe
de
should
viure i
be as an
entendre.
important actor,
Sempre,
defending our
això
way
és una mica
of
discorrellat,
life
perquè
and to
nosaltres no
understand
m'ho
the world.
sentit, però
I know I
la
sound
majoria de
like a
vegades que
broken
parlo de
record.
l'estat del
You
benestar
might have
i
heard
parlo
me
d'Europa
speak
faig
about this,
referència al
about the
president Lula quan
welfare
se li va
state
donar el Premi
and Europe. I tend to
Nacional a
mention
Catalunya
Mr. Lula, the president,
que l'estat
when
del
he was
benestar
given
doncs,
the
tindria que ser
award,
considerat patrimoni de la humanitat,
and he
l'estat
said
del
that
benestar
the
europeu,
welfare
i que per
state
tant la
should be
tendència tenia que ser
considered
aquesta. Això,
world
evidentment, era
heritage. Well,
abans de
this
l'anterior
happened
crisi econòmica i
before
abans de que
the
Europa
earlier
fos una
former
referència a nivell
financial
mundial
crisis,
doncs,
and
en drets
before
socials, en drets
Europe
polítics,
became a
en drets
reference in
econòmics,
social
i
rights
iniciés un camí que va
and
ser el
political
camí
rights.
de les retallades, el camí
And
també
from that moment
doncs, de
onward, there
tenir
were
de
a lot
vermell
of
la
cuts on public
Mediterrània
policies, on
amb tota la
public
política d'immigració i el camí
expenditure,
doncs, de tantes i
all
tantes
of these
retallades.
migration
No?
policies
És a
in the
dir, a
Mediterranean.
Europa les retallades
In
ens les
Europe,
obliga. En canvi,
these
els drets socials
cuts
són a
were
conveniència de cada estat si li venen de
forgotten,
gust aplicar-los o
but
no.
imposed
Jo
on
crec que
everyone,
aquest és un
whereas
dels
social
grans canvis
rights,
doncs, que hi ha d'haver.
well,
Si s'ha
they
d'obligar
depended
una
on every
política
member
econòmica,
state.
també s'ha
If we forget
d'obligar
about
a que hi hagi
economic policies,
uns drets
we
socials,
should also
mínims.
remember that
També
social
per no
rights
fer un
must be
discurs
respected everywhere.
negativista absolutament,
I don't mean
esperem
to sound
que amb la
completely
nova
negative,
política
because I hope that
dels
with
ajuts
the
doncs, i dels
new
projectes del Next
policy
Generation que han de vindre
of
en
the next
Europa,
generation
en el conjunt de tota
policies and
Europa, en el marc
subsidies
europeu,
that should be a
suposi el
reality
canvi de les
within the European
polítiques.
framework.
Suposi el
Hopefully,
canvi
there will be a
doncs,
change
que
in these
veritablement no
policies,
passi com l'anterior crisi econòmica, que la crisi
and that we
econòmica
don't
que la
go
van
through
patir
what
més
happened
els
during the
països
financial
del sud
crisis,
que
that
els
the
països del
southern
centre i que els
countries
països del nord, i
suffered
per tant que fos
that
una veritable
much more, were
política
hardest hit
europea
than
d'economia productiva
northern
i
or
al mateix
central
temps
countries
doncs, de
because
cohesió
of their
social,
productive
que són les
economy, but
dues
also
dimensions. No? Però
their
ara
social
podríem dir que
rights
al
and labor
mateix
rights,
temps
which
hi
are
ha
the
una
two
primera
dimensions.
responsabilitat
So from
que evidentment és de
the
l'estat
very
espanyol,
beginning,
però hi ha una segona que és
the
del conjunt
Spanish state,
d'Europa,
the Spanish
doncs
government is
estem mirant cap a un
responsible
altre
for what
costat
happened,
amb
but
els fets
also the
migratoris doncs, que en aquests
EU
moments estan passant a
looked
Canàries
the other
o han
way
passat a altres
about
llocs, doncs,
what's
en aquest cas,
happening on the Canary
a
Islands
la
with migrants,
Mediterrània. Per
or
tant,
what has
hi ha una
happened
porta oberta
in many
d'esperança
different places in
amb
Europe.
el Next Generation
There's
i
a
esperem
ray
que
of hope
veritablement
with the next
sigui una
generation
cascada
concept.
en
We
el
hope
sentit
this
de
is
definir unes grans polítiques
a
que
cascade
abarquin
of
un nou model
measures with
productiu, que
a
abarquin una
large
transició justa, que abarquin uns
policies
processos de
addressing a fair
digitalització del sistema
transition,
productiu
digital
amb drets, que amarqui
processes
unes
of the
polítiques
productive
d'igualtat, però també hi ha el risc
fabric
que a
with
nivell d'Europa i a nivell de cada
equal
estat sigui
opportunities,
senzillament
but there's a risk as well,
un
which
element
is
de
that every
repartidor
member
de
state
recursos i no un element doncs, de
distributes
cohesió de progrés.
resources
És
the way
clau
they
la
want
dimensió de
instead
la
of
crisi del Covid.
ensuring
No
progress for
sabem
everyone.
encara a quins
Don't know
nivells
yet
arribarà, però
what
el que
the
sí que
COVID
veiem és que no
crisis
s'acabarà a
will
curt termini
have as a
i que, per
repercussion,
tant,
even though we know it's
la
not
plena
going to be
activitat econòmica
short term.
doncs no vindrà
We're not going
segurament
to
fins
achieve
d'aquí un any
full
segur. I vés a saber
economic
si amb
activity
les
until at
dimensions, amb les
least
mesures
a
sanitàries
year
que
or
es
two
puguin fer són
fast.
suficients,
So
per
we'll
unes
see
o
whether
altres, o
the
segurament
economic
aquesta crisi
measures that
econòmica
apply are
tindrà
necessary
un més llarg termini. És la primera crisi
to
econòmica
compensate for this
que
economic
li hem
crisis.
de fer front sense
It is a first economic crisis we need to
manual,
face
perquè les
without
anteriors crisis
having
econòmiques
a
tenien o
handbook,
retallaves,
because
ja hem vist l'experiència,
earlier we
o
had
feies
either
polítiques
cuts
de
on public
reactivació econòmica
expenditure
injectant diner perquè
or
l'economia es mogués.
money,
Aquí,
new money
evidentment, hi ha
was
un doble
injected
element.
into the
Hem
economy
d'injectar diner per frenar certes
so that it
activitats
could
econòmiques que
be
no poden funcionar
rekindled. Obviously,
i al
we
mateix
need
temps hem
those
d'injectar diner
public
públic per
subsidies
donar
for
activitat
activities
econòmica.
that
Per tant, és trobar
cannot
l'element
run
d'aquest
by
equilibri és la
themselves,
dificultat
but we need
en
to
aquests
strike a
moments,
balance,
en
which
aquests
is quite
moments
difficult
de
right
Catalunya, de
now
l'estat
in
espanyol
Catalonia,
i
in
d'Europa.
Spain, and
I
in
aquest és
Europe.
el gran repte, i aquest és el
So
gran repte en el
this is
qual
our
doncs, Europa
greatest
jo crec que ha de
challenge,
tindre un
and I
paper
believe that
molt més
Europe should
protagonista.
have
Més enllà
a
de si
primordial
ens
role.
confinem a la nit, al cap de setmana o
That's
tot el dia, que
regardless
són
whether
elements,
we have
evidentment,
lockdown
sanitaris i
during the
necessaris.
evening hours or the
Cal un
weekend.
relats, perquè
I mean,
estem
these are
veient
necessary
que amb els
measures as
matisos que
well.
vulgui, el Covid a Europa
But
està afectant
the
bastant
COVID
a tot arreu de la
crisis
mateixa manera, per tant
is
calen calen
impacting Europe
unes
as a
respostes
whole,
globals.
at large. Therefore, it
Sobretot,
requires
i la
a
reflexió
more general
positiva i de
response.
reptes de futur que
Now,
volia
about
plantejar
challenges for
de
the
cara al futur
future,
és
and
el que situava
on a
ja
more
en algun
positive
moment.
note, this is what I mentioned
Que també en
earlier.
qüestions de drets socials hi
In
hagin les
terms of
mateixes
social
obligacions
rights, we need to
que
have the
quan
same
s'apliquen
kind of
polítiques de
duties
retallades. Tant
that have been considered when we had the economic cut policies. Let me just give you a recent example, and I think that Esquerra Republicana is along the same lines. Right now, the Spanish government will have to ratify the European Social Charter. We hope this becomes a reality. And they also need to sign the guarantee protocol, which is necessary so that the Spanish government can comply with the European Social Charter, which obviously should have a minimum wage requirement. It's a recommendation, but there are also other principles that are obligations. And there are several things that need to be solved at the European courts before the Spanish government can sign this protocol on guarantees. And yet another thought, I think that Europe requires this cooperation, especially in Catalonia. The future, from a social point of view, is that Europe should have a social bare minimum requirement, such as the subsistence income, but also a certain level of education and social protection all across Europe. No citizen in any member state should go beyond that bare minimum of social protection in the continent. And the fair transition should be the real policy being implemented today. It is fundamental. Obviously, there will be decisions made about the climate change crisis, but this may destroy more and more jobs. Let me just give you an example about Catalonia. Ribera d'Ebre County. It is a county where half the area was burned down because from an economic point of view, activity ceased. And then the other half of the country lives off nuclear energy plants. So they're becoming, the whole country is becoming a wilderness, a desert. It's an extreme example, but in Catalonia, we have automobile industry. We want to favor factories, but lay citizens should not pay the price for this crisis, because many citizens work in these factories, obviously. So we need this floor, this bare minimum of social protection in Europe. And I'll finish now with some advertising for the UGT trade union. They told me I have 10 minutes and I've been speaking for 10 minutes. You can see behind me that we have the Sustainable Development Goals and how we understand them. This little circle, well, apparently everyone's holding climate summits and putting on the pin. We believe that these dimensions need to be painted with the colors of equality, sustainability, and social justice and freedom of democracy. That's what we should be fighting for. That's it for me. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Camille, for your contribution and for pointing out what are the outstanding duties of the Spanish government, these guarantees of social and labor rights. You mentioned one of the topics that we will continue speaking about, which is the challenge of the environmental transition and how the European Union can also face this climate emergency.
She is a member of the European Parliament in the group Greens European Free Alliance and member of the German party Alliance 90 Green. Between 2017 and 2019, she worked as an advisor for Sustainable Development Goals in Berlin, where she continues working as advisor for human rights. Previously, she had also worked in the cabinet of the president of the United Nations General Assembly in New York as a counselor on the Sustainable Development Goals. Welcome, Anna. The floor is yours.
So I don't know, the translation was gone. I'm speaking now, yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Do you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can
Perfect.
hear you, Anna.
Sorry, the translation was gone, so I didn't understand anything, but I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Indeed, my name is Anna Cavazzini. I'm a Green MEP from Germany, and in the European Parliament dealing with internal market issues and trade policy. And also I'm the Vice President of the Brazil delegation, so also having a close look on what's happening in the Amazon. I was trying to listen carefully to what have been said before. I'm congratulating you for this interesting conference. I think it's amazing that you also have speakers from all over Europe, which of course makes a truly European conference. I think we as like the Green family or as the German Greens, we always have this approach to the European Union that we are very pro-European, that we always defend the European idea, but on the other hand, of course, also try to criticize what is going wrong and put our finger in the wound when we see something is going wrong. And I think there is always like this very fine balance between these two between these two approaches, because also from a German perspective, and I think you have similar problems in Spain, there is also a lot of political forces that want to destroy the European Union and that want to get back to nationalism, that want to, for example, also abolish the European Parliament because they say, yeah, it's not serving to anybody, it's not serving to the people. So in the last European election campaign, especially, but also before already, the German Greens took a very pro-European stand. But on the other hand, and I think this is especially also true from probably a Spanish or Catalan perspective, that with, especially when with the Euro crisis, with everything that happened, you cannot just say, yeah, everything is great, let's just continue how it is. So also in the German Greens, we of course had this message of change in our election campaign. So a double message, like pro-European, but also change. I think what happened in the last European elections was very, very interesting because we were coming from this, I don't know, 10 years of Euro crisis, social unrest, huge split between the North and the South, and then also you had the migration crisis. So it was very, very hard to put real progressive topics on the agenda because the European Union was so busy with itself and solving the crisis and solving everything. And what was really interesting with the last European elections, especially, of course, with the climate movement, with the Fridays for Future movement, but also a lot of other different civil societies and green movements, we, not everywhere in Europe, but in general, the Green family won a lot of more seats in the European Parliament. And I think if you look at a lot of different outcomes in different EU countries, the climate issue played a huge role. And I think this led the EU Commission to adopt its big strategy, the EU Green Deal. And again, I think the Greens had a kind of critical, constructive approach to the Green Deal since the beginning. I mean, we had been campaigning for the EU Green Deal already in 2009 in the Euro crisis, actually, because back then we said, yeah, we need a lot of investment to overcome the crisis, but we need to use this investment to transform at the same time. So the Green Deal is actually a very green concept, but it took 10 years until it really got to the top of the EU policymaking. Since the beginning, we tried to push the Commission in not leaving the Green Deal as an empty shell and not pure rhetorics. But I think we have to say a big win is already that the rhetorics is there, because the last 10 years, this was not the case. I think we really got one step further in saying, okay, now we have the Green Deal and we can build on that. And there is also very good concrete policy initiatives, legislation coming out of this Green Deal initiative. So we see a lot of progress in terms of sustainability in social and ecological transition on EU level. For example, the European Parliament a couple of weeks ago only voted on the most ambitious climate targets ever and on the first European climate law at all. And I think this is a huge success, and we see basically different or similar legislative initiatives by the Commission, like raising the climate targets, trying to reform the European emissions trading scheme, implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or coming forward with the so-called renovation wave that has the goal of really trying to get basically all the houses in Europe better insulated. Or what I'm working a lot on is also the question of circular economy. The EU Commission and also the Parliament is at the moment really at the forefront of implementing what we Greens had asked for forever already, like a really circular approach when it comes to the economy, not wasting even more of these precious resources, creating more waste, but getting a proper circular approach with basically designing the products already better, implementing the right to repair, making the products live longer, that they don't automatically break after 2 years in order to make the consumers to buy a new product. So these are very, very interesting approaches. And I can really feel from a German perspective, often the EU is much further when it comes to sustainability if I compare to my German government. And I think this is good because we need this pressure, we need this also discussions on the European level. What I can also see is that the European Parliament got a little bit more green. I mean, it is not the case that the Greens as such, the Greens IFA, of course, I only say green, but just always think it as Greens IFA, this is clear, that we are like basically one group, one family, grew a little bit bigger, and this is very, very good. Yet we are still a very small group. But if you look at the voting patterns, you can see that also the other groups basically shifted more towards a more climate-friendly voting behavior. And this is, of course, also good. On the other hand, there is still a lot of things to do. Because, as I said, we have to really make sure every day that this Green Deal doesn't just stay an empty shell or pure rhetorics. And there is policy areas that still lag behind and are completely not compatible with the Green Deal. And I would say the worst example when it comes to sustainability is clearly the EU agricultural policy. Probably you have followed it a little bit. We had a vote in the European Parliament that ended up, to my mind, really in a very disastrous way. It's the Parliament that in other areas is much more progressive, as I said, in the agriculture policy voted to a business as usual EU agriculture policy. And this is really frustrating if you think that in the next 7 years, the biggest chunk of the EU budget will be spent in a very unsustainable way, like it had been in the last years. And with that, you see that, of course, the pathway towards sustainability is still a difficult one because there is so much lobby interest, there is so much path dependency, especially when it comes to money. There is groups that benefit from the current system and not want it like easy to change. So the fight is constantly ongoing. A second policy area where I see still a lack of compatibility with the Green Deal is the trade policy. This is an area I'm working on as well. For example, I'm working a lot on the EU-Mercosur deal. It is a trade agreement with the 4 Southern American countries like Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and the EU, which is as such okay. But the problem is that the current EU trade agreements don't have enforceable environment and social standards. And they're basically focused on deregulation and liberalization, but without guaranteeing a proper implementation of those standards. And this is especially tricky when it comes to the deforestation rates in the Amazon, because with higher agricultural exports, with this trade agreement, the deforestation rates in the Brazilian Amazon will increase. And this is just one example where you can see the trade policy is not yet in line with the Green Deal. This is in other big areas. The Greens IFA family is really fighting for getting some change going. So probably to tell you that I think the picture is, or the glass is probably half full, I would say. We really have been going a long way, especially when you compare it to the last 10 years. I think there was so much progress. The EU Green Deal, the climate emergency is on the top of the agenda. It's in every speech of Commission President von der Leyen. But of course, you really need to look into the details. You need to look at all the policy areas. What is at the moment, and this is my last point, the big fight is, of course, in the budget and the recovery, and this was mentioned by my previous speaker. In general, I think it is amazing. It is a big step forward when it comes to European integration, that the member states agreed on this recovery facility, on the recovery money, because it's really a lesson learned from the Euro crisis that more solidarity is needed, and we cannot just leave countries affected by the Corona crisis alone. We need proper EU solidarity for that, and this is really a big step forward. What was now the big fight for the Greens is, of course, how to use all of that money to make it work for the transition. Because if we take so much money now in our hands, it's only there once. I mean, we cannot again mobilize next year so much money to fight the climate crisis. We need to use all this money from the EU budget, but also from the recovery budget. Basically, it's two different chunks of budget to make the transition going and to really transform our economies, our society into a CO2 friendly economy. And this is a big fight. And I can say, I have the feeling the Greens didn't completely succeed, but made some important points in the budget. For example, having clear climate and also biodiversity spending targets, and also in the recovery money implementing this principle of do no significant harm. It's of course still to be defined what it exactly is, but of course the idea that we had in mind that we don't use the money for fossil economy, but that we only use the money for future-oriented economy. And yeah, at the moment, you know, this is blocked by Hungary and Poland, because we also still have this rule of law conflict, a lot of conflict in Europe. But I really hope that yeah, we can make the crisis, this pandemic, the Corona crisis, work in order to really also tackle the climate crisis, because otherwise I think we have a problem. But Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President at the moment, is still very tough on that, despite a lot of lobby pressure. I see it like every day also in the German news, like the economy is saying, or the businesses are saying, yeah, with the Corona, we cannot have new climate regulations now, it will kill us. It's very hard. So I think this is at the moment the most urgent thing, to keep the pressure up and make the Corona crisis work. It sounds a little bit tricky, but make the Corona crisis work for also tackling the climate crisis. Yeah, I thank you very much for listening to me. Unfortunately, I have to go to another party event because we have two parallel events at the moment. So I'm leaving you here, but I wish you a very good conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for your contribution. Continuem.
We will now continue. We now devoted some time to understanding the European Green Deal, so that it's not just a hot air, just something on paper, but rather that it's an instrument that can be applied. So we've been hearing our colleague from the Greens, Aoife, as one of the groups that have defended this green renewal process in European institutions. And now we will move on to a different topic that Anna also mentioned, which is the significance of how, based on our budget and the recovery and reconstructing policies, we can tackle this green challenge. We'll speak about social justice, about fair taxation, which is the term that is being used. We'll speak with Albert Castellanos, who's the Secretary General of the Vice Presidency Department, as well as the Economy and Treasury Department of the Catalan government. He has held several positions in the area of economic management at the Catalan government. In 2016, he was appointed the Secretary General for Economic Promotion, in charge of competition and regulation at the Catalan government. And then he became in charge of the Treasury Department. And he also has experience in economic promotion as an executive secretary of the Axio agency, and also supporting research as executive director of AGAOT. Good morning, Albert. You have the floor. Thank you, Sara. Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank the Esquerra Republicana political party for counting on the Catalan government at such an interesting event, which is an opportunity to reflect upon what might not be our natural political arena, which is the European Union. As Sara said, I'm here to speak about the role played by the EU budget and specifically taxation in the development of all of these challenges ahead of us that have been mentioned by Camille, Anna, or Mary Tail so far. So I'd like to give you a couple of snapshots about what I believe the Commission should evolve into this fair taxation and more credible European policies. And I think that all the speakers mentioned this. Now, in order to have European policies that are credible, we have a fundamental right, which is that the EU budget should have a greater weight. This EU budget, if you take a look at the multi-annual financial framework, it is shy of 1% of the GDP. It's not even over that figure. It's limited, therefore, based on the European economy, but there's another yet even more limited weight of what we call own revenues, own resources. More than 75% of revenues that come into that European budget are either directly or indirectly more or less regulated transfers of member states into that budget. Therefore, that direct dependence on member states means that, well, the room for maneuver, let's say, of European policies is very, very limited. So in order to make large-scale decisions, we're always dependent on how the member states think about the change. There was a recent discussion last summer about the definition of the Next Generation program, which will be key in the upcoming years for the recovery of Europe as a whole. It was extremely difficult because of that very low tax sovereignty of the European Union. Those of you who are economists or are more familiar with tax issues in the mid-18th century, unfortunately, the sound is off. We cannot hear the speaker. We cannot hear the speaker, unfortunately. We lost the audio. We hope that this can be fixed. And it's back again. Now, how do we go about this? How can we attach a greater weight to EU taxation and budget so that these can give rise to more credible European policies? I think there are three possibilities. They're fundamental, and in just 10 minutes, I'd like to summarize them. First, an area in which so far the EU has not succeeded, which is the development of its own taxes and resources. I'm speaking about the Commission. Which taxes could we stress? Well, three of them stand out. And out of these three, two of them, I believe, should be the Commission's own taxes because of its own properties. First, those that tax incomes and economic activities that need to be taxed on a supranational level, where the single market takes all its relevance into consideration. Secondly, they should be activities, and I think that we all agree on this, that are not very taxed. They're taxed to a lesser degree because they refer to activities that have acquired a great importance in the past few years. There are two such taxes that the Commission has already placed on the table, and the Parliament has debated them, which is the financial transaction tax, taxing the acquisition of shares, and then the digital service tax. I think that these two taxes fulfill those requirements, and therefore they should be the Commission's own resources. Unfortunately, we need to admit that they have not been very successful in terms of this reinforced cooperation system, which has been used to adopt them. Now, it is true that if we speak about France or Italy or Spain, these taxes will become a reality momentarily, but we haven't been able to find commonalities on the definition of the taxable event, for instance, or even the tax rates. If we try to define Europe ambitiously, if we're highly committed with this kind of tax sovereignty that we want the EU to have, we cannot afford these failures or this lack of success when coming up with these common taxes. There's another tax that I believe is fundamental, and Anna mentioned it. The Commission, well, she said that it's proven through the Euro MP statements that everyone's becoming more and more aware of environmental issues, and this has made it possible to adopt very ambitious, very necessary pieces of legislation, such as the one that was adopted in 2019 and has great significance, which is to ban putting a shelf life on single-use packaging, which is quite significant. And what the European Budget Commissioner says is that it doesn't make much sense to develop ambitious regulations that go beyond, let's say, other international economic areas, and by the same token, to let products that do not fulfill those environmental standards into the EU. So one of the taxes that should take on a greater role in the next few years are those tariffs that tax products that do not fulfill the same environmental standards as the European Union. Otherwise, we would be weakening, we would be applying this double standards, and this will not be sustainable for a European economy or politics. And what I'm saying about the environmental area could also be transferred to labor legislation and social rights. So these very quick ideas about the own resources that the Commission should have, and they could help increase European taxation. Now, second point, which is tax harmonization. It is obvious that the European Treaty, the European Union Treaty, only advises the harmonization of VAT and customs duties, which means that most European Union countries have tax systems that are diverse, and the role or the weight of public budget varies significantly amongst countries. I believe that over the short run, trying to harmonize the way of our tax systems and public budgets, we would be rushing through these, and I don't believe it's detrimental to have a diversity of tax systems. We are not as homogeneous or harmonized from a social and economic perspective in Europe, so that we can afford an economic or tax system that is the same or very similar all across the board. However, we should be fighting, opposing tax difference when we speak about taxes that generate this race to the bottom in terms of the tax system. We're talking about those tax elements or revenues that travel easily from one country to another when there are different tax systems, and therefore taxes, countries with a low tax system for economic activity, and they are favoring its own economic activity, but because of these tax reasons, attracting a lot of other businesses. And I believe that the main challenge that this tax harmonization should tackle is the corporate tax. A corporate tax where we have tax rates in France like 38%, and then in Ireland 12.5%. It's not sustainable to have such a difference in Europe, because they end up bringing about this kind of race to the bottom phenomena. this whole discourse is becoming more and more prominent. If you want to attract economic activity, if you want more companies, you should lower your tax rate of the corporate tax. So this kind of tax harmonization is necessary. It is indispensable, I would say, if we want to maintain EU budgets, but also member states' budgets. Therefore, we need that budgetary strength to preserve this world heritage, in Lula's words, or what Camille said, one of the most fundamental rights of the EU. So, tax harmonization, own resources, working on the corporate tax, and finally, we should also be committed to fighting tax fraud. From that point of view, the Commission has taken steps forward, and I believe that these should be noted. In July this very same year, they adopted a plan to reduce tax fraud practices amongst member states. There are initiatives that are not merely institutional, but for instance, the support of the European Parliament on the tax observatory, led by Gabriel Zugman, for instance. However, I believe that we need a more clear commitment, and we need to be more realistic. If what we want to do is to tackle tax fraud within the European Union, we need what any other kind of tax administration needs, which is a smooth exchange of tax data amongst all tax authorities in member states. How can this be an effective exchange? Well, I think that in order to be truly effective, we should do this through, well, the creation of a European tax authority, because that would allow us to coordinate and to crisscross all the data, the tax data coming from member states, and therefore to detect possible cases of fraud more quickly. Now, what's the problem? And why are all of these issues that I mentioned on European taxation related to one another? Because developing a European tax authority without having its own tax concepts is quite difficult. We want to exchange this. Our tax rates should be comparable. So it makes sense to be committed with this political system with its own taxes that can become more relevant in the EU budget. To be fair, in the past few years, we have the Fiscalis program from 2014-2020 that aimed at precisely that, to exchange tax-related data among member states. However, even though good results were achieved, and they believe that this kind of fraud or savings, let's say from the point of view of tax administrations, is estimated to be 888 million euros. But in relative terms, even though this has been great work, this figure is much lower than the tax fraud detected only by the Catalan tax authority in the region. So obviously it should be much more efficient, which means that we need this European tax authority to act proactively and to crack down on tax fraud. I'll finish with three proposals. We've been asked to be more positive, so maybe other experts will say that this is utopian and cannot be applied. However, first, this has to do with the EU's own resources. I think that the European Parliament should have ample powers to suggest, to put forth and to adopt its own tax sources, as well as the tariff policies. I think that this will happen sooner if it goes through the European Parliament. Secondly, we believe that this reinforced cooperation mechanism should apply as well to tax harmonization processes, even though specific member state might want to pull away from the union, but that's a risk we should take on. That's my personal opinion. And thirdly, what I mentioned about tax fraud. We need to set up a single tax authority so that any administration with a political party with political power obviously has control over its own duties and taxes. That is why we need our own tax authority. And I think this would be a summary of my proposal to take a leap forward into a stronger European taxation, because this would mean greater political sovereignty and credibility in our policies. Thank you. Thank you, Albert, for all of these specific proposals in economic governance and fair taxation. We will now introduce our next speaker.
She is the Secretary of International Affairs of Eusko Alkartasuna and current President of the European Free Alliance. From 2007 to 2010, she was Deputy of the Provincial Government of Araba for Basque Culture and Sports and Procurator in the Juntas Generales de Araba, the regional parliament of Araba, for 8 years. She's an interpreter and she has worked for over 25 years in European and international institutions. Welcome, Lorena.
My mic. I had forgotten to switch my mic. Thank you very much. But I'll start in Catalan. So, m'han demanat que parli sobre
I've been asked to speak about multi-level governance at the European Union and its institutional reform. I decided, however, to choose a different title, towards a federal reform of Europe of the peoples, and a second title, which is the meaning of democracy in the 21st century. Because we need to say this up front, the current European Union is no longer a democratic institution. Jean Monnet and Alfredo Spinelli imagined a Europe of the people, not only a Europe of the states. It is time to launch a renewal, a fundamental renewal movement. We need to seriously tackle the decision-making and the governance of a complex system, which is the European Union. Obviously, it can be feasible if there are only 6 countries, but if there are 27 countries, we need to reform treaties deeply. Currently, the 27 members of the EU are stuck as part of the rules that the states themselves have adopted. So this unanimous decision-making mean that, there are many examples of how these recovery plans, the recovery funds have been used. How is it possible that 2 or 3 member states can block the whole EU system? How come a minority of far-right governments can have such advantages at the EU? We cannot continue this way. The founding fathers were moved by the power of ideas, not the idea of power. Therefore, we need to go back to this internal creativity if we want the EU to survive. And the EU will survive if it is able to transform itself into the Federal Union of the peoples of Europe.
I will go on, if you allow me, in English. That's for the interpreters. So, from the Scottish referendum and the ongoing independence campaign in Catalonia, to the Eurosceptic surge and the tragedy of Brexit, IFA and its members have worked tirelessly for the self-determination of all peoples and to build a better Europe. I will give you an example of what can be done with a bit of creativity. IFA could not admit the loss of 4 MEPs against the will of the nations, Wales and Scotland. Well, in our last General Assembly, we have become the only European political party to have incorporated them as observer MEPs in our statutes. In such a way, they will be able to be present and active in the EU political life. If you look at the present EU picture, you can see 3 levels of competencies. On the top, the supranational, the Commission and some EU institutions. On the bottom, the sub-state level, the powerless Committee of the Regions, the totally absent European citizenship, And I would even put in that category the European Parliament, given its scarce right of initiative. And in the middle, we have the governments of the states. Why is it so? Because the successive state governments have displaced the power of the people and the power of the peoples and taken the centrality of decision-making in the EU. Governments should realize that alone, or even summing up the 27, they are not anymore masters of their destiny. They would be much stronger if they would transfer part of their deteriorated power to the supranational level, and if they would trust the sub-state level and allow themselves to feel the strength of the peoples that express their will with their votes, but have also so much to say and decide about our common future for our common good. It is time to implement a real representative and participatory democracy. This is an opportunity to work differently, for the EU to deal with sub-state authorities more directly. This would also be a chance for regional governments or municipal councils to interact more directly with the Union, increasing engagement and awareness of the benefits of EU membership. The democratic process itself is rapidly evolving. Democracy is a very physical process. Dropping a voting paper into the ballot box is an important ritual, but after the pandemic, we should open the door to the digitalization of democracy. Estonia, a small state but internationally recognized for its advances in the field of digitalized society and internet freedoms, is the only member state of the European Union which gives all voters the possibility to vote over the internet in state elections. We cannot forget that across the world, turnout in elections has been falling significantly. If the European citizenship had the possibility of having a say, participate on matters that directly concerns them and be part of the decision making, the attachment to the European institutions would be certainly greater. The European Commission held its first fully digital cross-border EU citizens dialogue just a few weeks ago, between the 27th and the 30th of October. 100 randomly selected citizens from Denmark, Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Lithuania came together online over the course of 3 days to discuss the democratic, digital, and green future of Europe. Representing the diversity of society, they engaged with one another in their mother tongue from the confines of their home, supported by simultaneous interpretation in 5 languages. Well, that is how the European Commission advertised it. Randomly selected citizens needs to be checked, and it has to be done, and it has been done only in the countries that I have mentioned, but if taken seriously, it is nonetheless a progress by itself. Online political activism has proven an extremely effective tool too. Online petitions, online fundraising campaigns, and meme sharing Facebook groups have been proven to influence political narrative. However, not all citizens are familiar with the online world, and accessibility is not uniform. We cannot allow the creation of a digital divide. It is up to us all to deliver a digital democratic dividend. To revitalize European democracy and to truly bring it closer to the people, a permanent system of European citizens' assemblies must be created, giving representation to all the peoples and communities across Europe. These assemblies could then be consulted and participate in the decision-making on various topics linked to the political priorities previously agreed upon the basis of consensus. I could not finish this general overview on decision-making without referring myself specifically to women and the youth. It is necessary to adopt positive action policies, preferential treatment, special measures and/or quotas to promote women's participation and youth participation at all levels of decision-making, and to set targets based on parity. When talking about the reform of the treaties, the issue of the EU internal borders must be addressed with a contemporary vision in the 21st century Europe. The EU is trapped within its own internal borders, so it is time to go beyond the Europe of the states. It is time to redefine the EU structures. Taken, as the previous speakers have said, the new European funds as an example, The EU must closely monitor recovery package funding and its distribution to safeguard against its misuse or abuse. More direct and closer cooperation between the European level and the local or sub-state levels is needed to prevent unfair distribution by out-of-touch states. A strengthened Committee of the Regions could serve as a second chamber of the European Parliament. An assembly for cities should also be explored, as mixing city authorities with national regional authorities in the Committee of the Regions is not balanced. Fourth measure that we could propose, the European Parliament must have the power to introduce legislation, which is not fully the case for the moment. And closer interinstitutional partnerships must be fostered too. For example, sectorial European interparliamentary assemblies composed of members of European, state, regional parliaments could be established to facilitate a much better coordinated and efficient implementation of policies. Obviously, mentalities need to change. And to foster a change in mentality, it is necessary to name things, to coin new words and concepts. The concept of variable geometry is already accepted in the EU to describe the idea of a method of differentiated integration in the European Union. It would enable groups of countries wishing to pursue a given goal to do so while allowing those opposed to hold back. It acknowledges that, particularly since the EU's membership almost doubled in under a decade, there may be differences among countries and there should be means to resolve such stalemates, as we were commenting on with the recovery funds. In parallel, IFA is developing the concept and principle of variable geography. And by variable geography, we mean a modular geography that favors the emancipation of all territories, because the EU is much more than the sum of its constituent member states. Europe must be seen as it really is, through a kaleidoscopic lens with multiple changing shapes and patterns, not with a single color. It is necessary to change perspectives. Relations between different territories have to be favored according to their needs and specificities, and the EU should indeed find a way to achieve it on the basis of two pillars: solidarity and pragmatism. So I will mention 4 cases, and with that I will end, in which the principle of variable geography should be applied. First, stateless nations that strive for independence. The case for self-determination has been strengthened as devolved authorities, even with their limited powers, have shown that they are able to run themselves more effectively when not encumbered by state governments. This is the case in Scotland and Wales. The fact that health powers are devolved in the British state has probably saved lives, with Scotland and Wales having the freedom to pursue their own often more cautious strategies than that of neighbouring England and the UK government. As Professor Timothy Waters, Associate Director of the Centre for Constitutional Democracy in the University of Indiana, has recently said, we should reframe secession as subsidiarity and respect the will of the peoples, because it is part of the European fundamental values, as you have also said before me. The EU should be bold enough to pave the way to the establishment of the principles and conditions to exercise the right to self-determination in the 21st century, to establish the right of all peoples to decide on their own destiny under full democratic principles and conditions. That is why IFA supports all efforts to write an EU convention to that end. And in that sense, some IFA parties and foundations are working now on a code of good practice for the democratic management of territorial conflicts of sovereignty that will be addressed soon to the EU institutions, the Council of Europe, and the OSCE. The second case is cross-border nations, the case of Catalonia, the Basque Country, but also Friesland, Macedonia, Silesia, to mention a few. Many of the nations and communities represented in IFA span across the borders of the current Europe of the states. During lockdown, the impact has been most detrimental to them. The variable geography principle should be applicable to overcome the artificial border divide and facilitate the daily life of those communities. And if talking about borders dividing two different nations, the case of Flensburg is worth mentioning, as it is internationally recognized as a symbol for intercultural coexistence and cooperation. The 1920 Schleswig plebiscite in the border between Denmark and Germany, agreed by both governments 100 years ago, is an example of lasting cooperation, of compromise, and of a firm commitment to democracy. The third case that I want to comment on is the islands. Apart from Scotland, Wales, and Yorkshire, IFA is also represented in Corsica, the Balearic Islands, the Canary Islands, and the Åland Islands. Although geographically disconnected, they share some of the same basic problems: sustainable tourism, transport, health facilities, and the same expectations: the respect and support for their distinct cultures and languages. The principle of variable geography should be applied to overcome the otherwise complicated issues arising from the strictly one-size-fits-all state-focused policies implemented by the different EU member states. And the last example, displaced peoples. There are many peoples trampled by history, mainly in Central Europe, which share the same culture and language, but are scattered in different EU states. Once again, this principle should be applied to lift all barriers to the promotion and use of their languages and distinct cultures. And as a result, the pro-European attitudes in those territories would certainly be enhanced. So to conclude, it is up to all of us to build the new European Union, a Europe truly united in diversity, based on international solidarity and respecting the right to self-determination, combined with a stronger and fairer, more democratic Europe, is the only way to recover after the immediate crisis recedes, and the only way to flourish in the future. And I will end with a question. Do we have the necessary majorities to reform the treaties? No. But when the need for change becomes an imperative, let's start individually and collectively changing attitudes, implementing new ways. Lockdown brought us the opportunity for reflection. The next stage will be the time for action. Let us pave the way for the federal union of the peoples of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorena. La Lorena ha acabat la seva intervenció.
Lorena finished her presentation by asking a question. So we remind you that you can continue to convey your questions to all speakers through the chat window. You can say exactly who you're addressing your question to, and in a few minutes, they'll be able to answer. We'll continue with Jordi Soler, who's the Secretary for International Policy at Esquerra Republicana. He's also a Euro MP. He's currently the Vice President of the Greens IFA group at the European Parliament and the Secretary General of the European Free Alliance. He was a mayor of his city, Carles de Montbui, for 12 years. And in 2012, he was also chosen as an MP at the Catalan Parliament, where he also worked on Europe and cooperation for development. In 2016, he was also part of the government of Catalonia, as Secretary for Foreign Affairs. You have the floor. Thank you, Sara.
On behalf of Esquerra Republicana, but also on behalf of the European Free Alliance, let me thank all the panelists for their very interesting contributions. Also, thanks to all of you that right now are following us from your places, from home. To you, Sara, for moderating this session today. I think it's important that ahead of this very much expected conference on the future of Europe, we have our positions on key issues regarding the future of the European Union, which is the future to us ourselves. Ara passo al català. Per contestar aquesta...
I'll switch to Catalan now. Now, in order to answer this question that has been asked to the different speakers, what should the future of the EU be? In my case, the area of foreign policy, I would like to mention 6 ideas that are the following. Now, regarding the role of the EU in the world, first, what should the EU do from that point of view? Well, the European Union, if it wants to become a global political player, a solid, consistent, credible player, the first thing that needs to be done is to want to be one. And you might think it's easy to say that, but I think it's a matter of ambition. Right now, we might think it's a disorderly second-rate player in the global arena in some fields. So there should be a will amongst the different member states of the EU to change that. From an economic and commercial point of view, it does play a very important role all over the world, even though this has decreased in the past few years because of other economic superpowers. But we should be equally important as well from the political point of view and in international relations. So we need to have that will to become a geopolitical actor and to share a diagnosis on the interests that the EU wants to defend in the world and through which instruments. So there's no alternative here. We need to find that solid presence of the EU in this context, especially with this increasing lack of stability, where safety and security are being eroded. The emergence of many conflicts not far away from European borders is very telling. Against the backdrop of recession of democracies and the loss of a democratic quality of some democracies that we thought were consolidated, as well as populisms and authoritarian regimes that are reminiscent of the old empires. Let's think about China, Russia, or Turkey with their expansionist policies. I'm not talking about empires from the point of view of the term from the 18th or 19th century, but there is a certain will of powerful international players to gain a great degree of influence over their surroundings and also over faraway lands. So it is urgent for the European Union to become a global actor committed with freedom, democracy, fundamental rights, and global justice. So I believe that this political justice is still under construction. It is being built both actively and passively. Actively because there have been relevant initiatives in international policy adopted in the past few years. Some member states have pushed forward to defend this idea of an EU as a global actor in the world. There have been proposals coming from Germany, for instance, or France that are interesting, proposals that were offered by the European Commission itself. So there's this clear intention from some member states to raise awareness, to raise the profile of the European Union. But this will is also being built indirectly, passively, because of other things that are happening in the international scene. For instance, there's a displacement of the Atlantic focus in the European Union. Obviously, there's this interest in the Atlantic, but also the Pacific. So there's this switching of the interest in the world. There are events that are happening all over the world and that are changing that. For instance, the United States, at least under Trump's administration, has withdrawn from many international mechanisms and that will that they had shown to lead the world in many fields of action. So I think that either because we want to or because the circumstances force us to, there's no other way forward. So the EU must become this global, solid, consistent political player in the world. Otherwise, we will remain stuck into this confrontation between the two big superpowers, which is the United States and China. And Europe should not be stuck in between this dynamic. It should leave that kind of competition and raise its own interests from a political and economic point of view. We're not defending the same kind of values that China is pushing for or that the US is pushing for. Obviously, from a political and economic point of view, we're closer to the States than to China, but we have our own characteristics, our own interests to defend. And we should not be falling into oblivion between these two superpowers. We should have our own weight in this arena. So first, the EU should consolidate that will to become a global actor. Secondly, there's not enough to have a will. We need to know whether we have the right tools, the right instruments to become that global actor. And there are problems from that point of view, significant ones, because the foreign policy of the EU, the way it's set up right now, is very intergovernmental. It's not federal at all. Therefore, we don't have that many powers in terms of this European, pan-European dimension. For instance, the common foreign and security policy or the common security and defense policy are decided unanimously at the Council, which means there's veto power, and any member state can veto this kind of foreign policy initiatives. And as Mr. Borrell was saying a few days ago, who's the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission for Foreign Affairs, my mission is to come to agreements, right? But this is not easy. And that's why we have this veto power there as the main hindrance. The second problem is that this policy obviously is intergovernmental, which means that the foreign strategies of member states and the EU foreign affairs strategies do not always agree. Sometimes they are opposed, even though what the treaties tell us is that the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union, that's where ministers share their opinion. And then once a common position has been agreed, they need to fulfill that and they need to implement those policies. But this doesn't happen often because member states wish to maintain special bilateral relations with their foreign players, or because they have historic interests because of special pressure being exerted by some member states, for instance, Spain in Latin America or France in Northern Africa, and we could find other such historic dynamics. Some member states also wish to raise their own profile in the international arena. There is sometimes competition to obtain special economic benefits working on their own. And all these factors are not conducive to a foreign affairs policy that is really pan-European. Diplomacy is still seen as the core of national sovereignty. That is why it's so complicated to deploy a truly European diplomacy, and also to do that with the right tools. What we have is a foreign action service as well as EU delegations, and in the best case scenario, they complement the diplomatic representatives of nation states. So the bare minimum we need is to have diplomats that are aligned and that push for the same strategic interest everywhere, which is not always the case. So my second point would be, let's try to come up with better tools, and it is needed to vote at the Council on the basis of a qualified majority, at least in specific areas of foreign policy. This can be done. It is foreseen in the treaties through what we call a gateway provision, and the Council can authorize by a unanimous vote, and that, or the Commission can authorize that the Council can act on a qualified majority. And a couple of years ago, 2018, the European Commission made a proposal to move towards this qualified majority in some areas, which I believe is quite interesting and we could agree with. They propose to use a qualified majority in 3 areas specifically for issues having to do with official positions of the EU regarding human rights. And this has happened before. The member states do not agree, for instance, on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations to defend one single shared position. And this weakens the credibility of the European Union in these international fora. There's another area which is sending civil missions, not military missions, but detaching civil missions. This should be decided without an unanimous vote. And then the imposition of sanctions. There's a recent example that is quite telling about this perverse dynamic of unanimity in foreign issues. For instance, in Belarus, because of the democratic conflict in Belarus, the EU decided to impose sanctions. However, they had to put off that decision for a whole month, even though it was obvious, because Cyprus, which is one of the smallest member states in Europe, blocked the imposition of sanctions because of their veto power. They wanted the EU to have a language and an attitude that would be, let's say, stronger towards Turkey, which is the eternal enemy of Cyprus. So they blocked, they vetoed sanctions, specific members of the government to Belarus because of something that was completely unrelated to what was happening in Belarus. And obviously, we cannot have a consistent foreign policy like that. Thirdly, I believe that the EU has to show a strong commitment towards multilateralism. If we want to have a stronger multilateralism that has been quite weakened in the past few years, this has to be done by the European Union, because the EU itself is an excellent example, one of the most successful examples of multilateralism. The existence of the EU is the result of an extraordinary example of multilateralism. So what we have today is multipolarity without multilaterality. We know that these are very strong, very long words, but there's a lot of opposed actors. We have superpowers. We have the EU, the US and China, and then we have very strong regional players, and they all attempt to push their way around to influence in their own surrounding by establishing their own alliances. But there is no common will, which had existed years ago, to solve issues that have an impact on the whole planet, and to do so through a real multilateral system. This has been severely damaged, not only because of Mr. Trump, who left many international fora, the WHO, the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, the Paris Agreement. Obama had already left UNESCO. So this has weakened the US, but there are other powers like Russia and China that do participate in these international fora. And obviously, they stand up for their own rights and values and rules that are quite authoritarian in nature. So what we need to do is to rebuild multilateralism based on the European values: freedom, democracy, and equality. So I do not agree with this idea that is coming around lately, which is alliance and collaboration between the most advanced democracies in the world in this multilateral framework. Because if the most advanced democracies in the world continue to defend these fundamental rights, human rights, and freedoms, and equality, etc., but if they do not if they don't do this in a united fashion, there will be other models that are completely unrelated to these values, and they will do their best to occupy that space. Fourthly, also the idea of open strategic autonomy and the relation between the soft and hard power within the framework of the EU. There's an open discussion. Even the notion of strategic autonomy itself is being used and bandied about as a buzzword in the European discussion. So there's this will for Europe to be able to choose to make its own decision autonomously to preserve European interests that are considered to be fundamental. For instance, specific strategic industries, and to avoid getting them sold to foreign investors, energy self-sufficiency, or from a medical point of view, we've seen this during the COVID crisis in terms of drugs and medical equipment. How can this be achieved? How can we become more self-sufficient from a strategic point of view, but at the same time remain an open economy, committed to free trade and to the rules of an open economy? What I would like to stress is this idea of strategic autonomy when we speak from the point of view of international relations and safety and defense. This is being used in order to justify, to legitimize a significant increase in the military budget. We were speaking about the multi-annual budget. In the next budgetary program, it'll be the first time in which there will be significant changes, and there will be a specific entry for military expenditure, military research, improvement of military capabilities, connectivity of its infrastructures for military use. It'll be the first time in such a budget. For some years now, some 3 or 4 years now, the European Union decided to reinforce what could be a European defense union in the future from a military perspective, to reinforce the military industry across Europe. So the idea is not to overlap, not to have 27, in this case, armies with their own armament that is completely disconnected from one another, but rather to look for efficiencies. However, in a context in which security has deteriorated, Europe cannot rely solely on soft power. Soft power should be obviously the main business card we offer as a political entity to the world. But there's this strategic autonomy as well to be considered. We should be able to act from a military point of view in a self-sufficient manner without depending as much on given industries from abroad. And this is what's legitimizing the increase in the military budget. Okay, if defense is part of the European budget, but at the same time, there's a decrease in defense budgets of the member states, that could make sense, because at the end of the day, if we save money from one side and then we spend more on the other, then okay, I could agree with that. However, what's happening right now is that all member states are increasing their military expenditure, and the EU now, for the first time in its history, includes military budgets as part of their general budget. Fifthly, I'm not sure how I'm doing with time, but I'll finish momentarily. There's something that the EU should do in the foreign arena, which is to increase the certain consistency between the narrative, the discourse, and the actual facts about how it defends human rights and how it practices those human rights. For instance, the EU should adopt a sanction regime for people involved in serious violations of human rights. This is something that other countries have already done. So it would be beneficial for the EU to have that instrument at its disposal, to be able to impose a sanction on individuals or organizations that have blatantly violated human rights. And another thing that is also important to remain credible abroad is to respect human rights within our borders and to include those human rights provisions as the main key issue to be defended in commercial treaties, in any kind of agreement from the EU to third parties. So we sign commercial treaties and agreements, but if such violations occur, all of these cooperation should be suspended. And finally, and I'll finish with this, the European Union should devote more efforts and resources to the prevention of conflicts and the building of peace and mediation. In the neighborhood of the EU, from the eastern and southern side, we have a lot of hotspots, conflicts that are either still active or that are stagnant or that are coming to a boiling point. And many people say the EU just leaves these conflicts aside, let them fester. We're talking about armed conflicts, and then when it escalates, the EU intervenes. Well, I think this shouldn't be the role played by the EU to get there once it has already escalated and a lot of war-created disasters have happened already. So working on prevention, because the neighborhood policy of the EU has decreased its aspirations. Some years ago, we wanted this neighborhood policy, the countries that are closer to the EU, geographically speaking, through this kind of foreign policies of the EU, we wanted them to come closer to the model of the European Union, democracy, defense of freedoms and human rights. Now, the only thing we aspire to is stability. So we just want stable coexistence with these countries, because we know that if it's stable, there are no bigger conflicts, and therefore all these roots of conflict, which can be poverty, extreme abject poverty, etc., we know that they give way to migration flow. So apparently we don't speak about democratization anymore. We are happy with just keeping it stable instead of defending the fundamental freedoms. If the EU wishes to become a consistent player, it should be more active in defending these values, especially in the countries that are closer to the EU, and to try to promote exactly the same values inside and outside the EU. That's it for me. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, Jordi, great. We will now move to the Q&A. We have received several questions through the chat window. We will ask these questions to the speakers so that hopefully they can answer us briefly. We'll start with 2 questions for Camille Ros. First, Jordi Villanova, who's asking, how could we homogenize labor markets in Europe? And what Jordi is saying is that the crisis that has been created by COVID-19 is something that has to be managed over the short and mid-run, but the European project goes beyond that. Therefore, it requires a change in the labor culture, as Jordi is saying, to adopt the culture of maybe Nordic countries with shorter working hours, higher productivity, and therefore higher wealth in terms of redistribution and in absolute terms as well. So that's the first question to Camille. How could we implement this change in labor culture in Europe and to move forward and homogenize labor markets? And I will link this with another question by Adam Majon. He's asking, how can we help this trade union organization so that it can expand to Europe as well? That's what he's asking. Do you think that European trade unions also have a very national view? What can we do to work on a trade union field across Europe? You have the floor, Camille. Thank you. I think I'll be able to answer both questions with one breath. When he says national, he means state-based, right? For every member state. I believe that this applies to all fields, but especially in the labor field and trade union relations. It depends on the kind of legislation that we have that regulates both fields. That is what conditions trade union action and trade union response. Every state in Europe has its own legislation in terms of trade union. Some member states promote trade union affiliation or membership, such as Germany, in collective agreements only apply to people who are members of trade unions that have signed that collective bargaining. Other countries in Europe, such as Italy, they also manage a great deal of benefits that the workers receive. So every labor regulation or legislation can decide whether trade unions are stronger or less strong, and also how trade union representatives are appointed or selected at every industry. So this obviously conditions those decisions. So the positive side for trade unions in Europe is that social dialogue is seen as a priority. There are, in some states in Europe, that's not the case, but I participated, for instance, a year ago on the European Federation of Trade Unions. I was there as a delegate, and I can tell you that there's virtually a unanimous position on trade union claims and positions in terms of equality, fair transition, the role that Europe should have. This is the good news. Let me just give an example. In the former economic crisis, we tried to have a common response to these economic cuts. Some countries in the south of Europe were on a general strike, others decided to demonstrate on the street. Depending on how the economic crisis hit a given country, trade unions reacted one way or another. So I'll finish by saying, going a bit more in depth in this idea of a bare minimum or a social rights floor, if we are moving towards a European framework with a bare minimum of social protection, I think that the labor claims will be included there. If the minimum wage, European minimum wage, is to be applied to all member states, if we have a more fair and progressive taxation that needs to be applied from the European level down, we need, obviously there's the principle of subsidiarity as well, but we need to protect social rights and labor rights of this European scope, which is not the case yet. Remember that we had to get mobilized to stop the European regulation, thinking about working hours that could go all the way to 60 hours. So this is Europe as well, right? We had to fight against that. It is indispensable that in this real social discourse in Europe becomes specific and turns into actions. What's the bare minimum in terms of wages, working conditions, working hours, pay gap, wage gaps, etc. All of these are necessary questions, and there should be some kind of framework agreement, right? Which is a term we use in labor relations. What are these minimum policies that should be enforced? In my former post, I coordinated the European Works Council of the UGT trade union. And we realized that when we spoke about risk prevention, for instance, of labor rights, there was a study done. And depending on every country's legislation, you realized where the risk prevention regulation was stronger and where it wasn't. And it was based on whether it was mandatory or not. So in some countries, sure, there's goodwill, there's a social awareness, and so on and so forth. But in other countries, it just depends on what the law tells you to do. So it's very important to have that framework. And even if we're talking about multinational companies, depending on where its headquarters are located, well, they have different regulations. So I think it's important to have that umbrella legislation that can trickle down into every society. Thank you, Camille. Next question, which is to Meritxell Serret. Nuria Cornet is asking about a certain dilemma. How can the European Union ensure that these rights and freedoms are respected and that its member states comply with this. So this is what Nuria is saying. Sometimes, Spain does not fulfill those prerogatives of the European Union, but what are the tools to denounce that? What can we do to ensure that this is complied with, going beyond the Court of Justice, obviously? Thank you, Sarah. Well, this is something that is quite cross-cutting. We've heard about people reflect upon this in all single presentations, even what Camille was just saying. How can the EU intervene and have a decision about how its member states are ruled? Well, this depends on its powers, on its abilities, on how strong it is, and how consistent it is. So the EU will be stronger and will be able to build more mechanisms, all kinds of institutions, the Parliament, the Commission, as long as it has more powers, as long as we decide to equip it with this greater degree of clout so that they can have their say in whatever national decision is made. I'm talking about any field here: justice, preservation of rights, functioning in a more harmonized way, trying to defend given standards of democratic function. Well, all of this is conditioned to the real strength of the European Union and the European Parliament and the Council and how they can enforce this. I believe that we have all touched upon this extensively. With this veto power that some member states, a couple member states of the Council still remains, they can block any kind of decision. So in order to avoid that veto power, we should move towards a more democratic way of working based on majorities and to develop this more federal model, this subsidiarity, so that, well, the right powers can be devolved or transferred to the European level. Let us not forget, however, that this event has been organized by a given political party with its own ideology and values. So behind all of the policies that the European Union has adopted, there's also an ideology. It's also important to keep working from left-wing parties that defend a given set of values, that have a specific vision of society, of social justice, of a sustainable development and equality, so that these values are present in European institutions, the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the Council. So there's no easy solution here. There's no easy fix. Not one single solution. We need this broad view and to gain strength. And this can only be achieved through citizens and their political representatives and social organizations in order to transform it and to help these changes evolve in the treaties and in the structures of the European institutions. Thank you, Meritxell. The next question, well, there's two of them. We'll bring them together, and they are for Lorena. Lorena, Mark Villamajor is asking, or he's saying that the original sin of the EU is that it was a construction of the states, and that once this was built, they asked the citizens to join and to agree. So he's asking, how can a different EU be built from the bottom, from the grassroots up, from the people? And there's another question by Patrick Vettel along the same line. He is saying, well, is there this idea of a federal Europe? Do you think it can scare away people who might not be against Europe but want to retain their own sovereignty? So maybe a Europe of the states, but of smaller states, could be an alternative. I'll answer in Spanish this time because I understand Catalan, but I speak Italian better, and it will be a disaster. I believe that we should not be limited by what we cannot yet achieve now, or they don't let us achieve. I believe that the personal and collective initiative, as I said, is fundamental. And this is summarized into a call for action. I believe that participatory processes, wherever we are, at whichever level we are, I'm talking about your neighbors, the district, the party, the nations where we are ruling or governing, well, this system, this capillarity from the bottom to the top in a more participatory way is what's going to help us move forward. This morning here in the Basque Country, I'm in Gasteiz right now, we have so many political conferences, and in one event, let's see if I remember correctly. What did they say? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. It was quite funny, I have to say, because he said that given that we cannot do it, we just don't do. And we remain paralyzed. Now, speaking about the states, as you mentioned, it is true that the system that has been set up is favorable to the states. So sovereignty, with this will to emancipate, to become national states, we say, okay, let us have more and more smaller states. That wouldn't be democratic, however, vis-a-vis other forms of autonomy in respect of traditions and language of many other regions, because they're fighting for that and they cannot become states. So we should not imitate nation states to solve everything. I believe that we need to find a way to work together as brothers at all different levels, to work together. Maybe because we come from, co-ops in the past, I think that we're all necessary. It's not a matter of imitating anyone. It happens with this machoism. There are women that adopt a more male attitude so that they can play a role in politics. That's the same for states. Even though I have to say there's something that Nicholas Olsen tends to say, is that when you want to become a state, you shouldn't wait, or you shouldn't behave as one. You should start acting like one. So that's what I would say. It's everyone's will, and we can change things. That has been shown already. It is feasible, as long as we have that will. Jordi mentioned this as well, internationally. Great, Lorena, thank you. An idea brought out by Pep Molina. He says that there are two generations of European youth that have suffered two crises back to back, the one in 2008 and this one. So international mobility, voluntary projects in Europe are not enough. Now, in the future, we need to seize this opportunity that the European funds are giving us for recovery, so that we can tackle housing policies, training policies, especially in the south of Europe and the Mediterranean basin. So this means that there will be a lot of reforms needed from a participatory, sustainable, and digital perspective. And he finishes by saying that we could be losing this social contract with a generation of hundreds and thousands of European youth if we don't tackle this urgently, with everything that is needed for the Europe of the future. It's something that I could maybe ask Camille Ross to respond to, because he spoke about this social bare minimum. Yes, it's not only about the youth, however. It's a bit more general, I believe. 15 years ago, if we asked around in Europe, everybody said, yes, Europe means social funds, welfare state, rights, okay. But this generation, who were not even teenagers 15 years ago, do not know this part about the European construction process. So if you talk to them about the EU, simplifying, of course, they say, oh yeah, Katz and Merkel and far right. So it is necessary, linking up to what has been said, that left-wing parties, social democracies in all different fields of action share a different kind of discourse. It's not only let's fight the far right, but also what kind of labor and social policies we should be adopting against the far right, because the far right is increasing reactively. Some years ago, the European youth wanted to have an Erasmus project and go to work or study in a different area of Europe as a personal growth and to obtain new knowledge. Currently, many young people who have traveled across Europe, from Catalonia, from everywhere, is because they couldn't find a job here, even though they had studied. For instance, the healthcare area, but there are many such industries. Exile, let's say, within Europe and the loss of human capital by countries is something that we need to fight. If you don't ensure a certain safety and labor stability, young people will not believe in Europe anymore, and they will fall prey to populism. So all kinds of left wing, the social, the labor, the trade union left should be offering a new model for Europe. So as Jordi Cuixart and Omnium say, these are the shared struggles, right? They call them the social struggles, that is. So in the European model, we need to see how we share Europe. Our identity is not exclusive, everyone here, regardless of what we think or who we vote, the Catalan society is very inclusive. So how can we build a Europe that is inclusive of a collection of identities, the ability to participate, whether you're big or small, north or south? So we need that project, an alternative project for the youth. And we don't yet have progress in terms of labor rights that can make this European project more attractive. That is why we need to push for these social measures and subsistence income. These are things that need to be debated with our young fellow citizens for this new Europe that is fundamental from a social and democratic point of view. Thank you, Camille. We'll continue with 2 more questions and then we'll call it a day. 2 questions for Jordi Soler. The first one is by Josep Canals, who's the Secretary General of MedCities, the network of 61 cities and metropolitan areas on the 3 basins of the Mediterranean. He's asking, how do you think that city councils can be representatives at the table where decisions are made that they will have to implement without the human and economic resources that are needed to achieve the goals established by them? And Jordi, you've been a mayor, so I'm sure you can contribute as well to that discussion. And then another question by Marc Villamajor as well. He's asking, what are the next steps of the Conference on the Future of Europe? Do you anticipate important changes in the treaties? And how is Esquerra Republicana going to participate in them? Well, regarding the first question about the role of municipalities, towns and cities as agents of foreign diplomacy, I believe that they are an actor that is obviously more significant, especially bigger cities. They play a role in diplomacy. There are many examples. MedCities is just a great example of this, of how bilateral relations, multilateral relations as well, amongst the cities and local agents can be extremely practical because of this both-way discussion, be able to discuss things amongst themselves and to instill trust, to gain trust between cities from different countries, different regions, but creating these bonds and this communication that can be significant in the preserving of Euro-Mediterranean relations, to bring closer 2 worlds that are not that far apart. Just take a look at where Algeria stands on the map, very close to Barcelona. However, from another point of view, in terms of values, systems, etc., ethos, they are far away. So I believe that city councils at the European Union are not considered as stakeholders, as interlocutors. Maybe from a symbolic point of view they are, but at the end of the day, when these policies need to be decided, they're not. And I believe that within the framework of this conference on the future of Europe, which is the second question, this should be reviewed. There are many European cities that could contribute a great deal to the definition of certain policies and to their implementation as well. We've been speaking about this current network of cities that want to welcome asylum seekers, not only in this field, also in the fight against climate change, in favor of the energy transition. Once these issues are landed onto the areas where they happen, where actions become more efficient, where we can fight climate change more efficiently, that's the local arena. So one of the discussions that the Conference of the Future of Europe should tackle is the role of cities in the construction and the implementation of EU policies. Regarding this conference, this is one of the flagship projects of the von der Leyen Commission. If we didn't have the pandemic this year, it was supposed to begin at about March or April. Obviously, this has been cancelled. We don't know exactly when this convention will start officially. We hope that it happens next year during the first semester. It is anticipated that it will last for 2 years, even though we don't know the specific discussion and decision-making mechanisms that will be in place, because we're waiting for the Council, that is the member states, to give their blessing to this proposal. The Commission already did suggest something. The Parliament offered possibilities to improve that proposal, and now it's up to the states to give their final blessing. So there's something quite important that was mentioned during in the question. This conference, we don't know exactly how it will function or what it will be made up of. Will it address reforms for member states? Apparently not. That was not part of the original proposal by the Commission, and I do not think that the member states want to tackle that right now. They do not want to address a new state reform. Let us remember we come from that failed experience of the Constitution for the Future of the European Union, of the Constitutional Treaty of the EU. When they spoke about the Constitution of the EU, it failed with the referendums in France and the Netherlands. They all said they did not want a European Constitution, so the whole project fell through. And that was a tipping point for the EU in terms of thinking about the EU model, even though a vast majority of this constitution was transferred onto the Lisbon Treaty, even though it was not called constitution anymore, it was just a treaty. That's how the EU moves usually. It modifies treaties. Many people believe that the Lisbon Treaty can still be improved. It can be perfected by refining some of the provisions. And bearing in mind that constitutional failure, no relevant player in the EU wants to go through that debate again. Then we, as European federalists, do believe that we should have a European constitution. That is a different opinion. We should rekindle that old debate. That's how we see it. However, that's not where we are right now in the current debate. Thank you, Jordi. I would like to thank all the different speakers and the participants for the questions that you conveyed. Thank you for keeping it very brief. Now we will give the floor to Pere Aragonès, who's the Vice President, Acting President of the Catalan government. He is the Regional Minister of the Economy and Treasury. He's also the National Coordinator of Esquerra Republicana, and some days ago he was chosen by our party members as the running mate for the next elections at the Catalan Parliament. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the European Free Alliance with the collaboration of Esquerra Republicana for holding today's event. It is extremely important that despite the COVID crisis and the pandemic, we keep meeting with one another, contributing with discussions such as this one, because they are more necessary than ever. We need to keep rethinking the European model, a model in which nations like ours want to be there as fully fledged members to defend the interests of our fellow citizens, our people, our neighbors. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown, and this was very visible at the beginning, the worst Europe in which countries competed against each other for healthcare materials and always defending their own national or market interests instead of the people's interests. But it has been seen as an important step forward as well with the recovery plan and how this whole machinery has been reactivated in terms of economic and monetary policy so that a healthcare crisis did not become a deep economic recession. So Europe has also taken steps towards the future, but we need to raise our view and go beyond that European model focused solely on the economy. We need to understand that this is a shared market, there are shared rules, and we need to focus this discussion on a Europe based on rights and freedoms, a place that is common to us all in terms of rights, freedoms, and the hopes of citizens of all peoples in Europe. We all want to have a direct voice. All nations want to have a voice and a say in European institutions, well above the interest of the old nation states. So it is very important to keep building this Europe of citizens. In the past few years, after a failure of the European Constitution that was probably too focused on states and a crisis in 2008, where it took 4 years to respond, now we have a new emergency and we need to keep building a shared model. But as I was saying, and this is a message I would like to convey, it's a project that should not just be economic in nature, financial, focusing on budgets. This is nothing if it doesn't include also a Europe of social rights, of opportunities, of redistribution of those opportunities, redistribution of wealth, helping economic activity become a shared prosperity for everyone. This is our will, and that is why events such as this one help us move forward along those lines. I would like to thank the European Free Alliance for holding this event, and I would like to thank everyone who's participated in it. We'll continue to work to raise the voice of our countries, our nations, in the heart of Europe, as our Euro MP colleagues are doing, Diana Riba and Jordi Soler, and all the other Euro MPs of IFA. We are very thankful to them for their work, but we'll continue working so that we can become very soon a new state of the European Union. Thank you. Okay, so with Pere Aragones's words, we will close officially this event, where we have done our best to offer our contribution, practical contribution to the whole discussion about the model of the EU. We thank once again all the speakers who have participated, as well as the technicians that have made this a reality, and everyone who's been following this event from their homes. Thank you all very much.